all of this is the idea that there is something wrong with collective action. As Margaret Thatcher said, there is no such thing as society, only families and individuals. When Charles Koch announced that his organization was going to be marshaling almost $1 billion in the next presidential cycle of spending, $1 billion, $900 million, he said that this money was going to be spent to hold back what he called the march of collectivism, to hold back the march of collectivism. That is the uniting idea behind everything that the Koch brothers fund, whether it is a tax on social security or labor rights or climate change. This is their unifying theory that collective is bad, individual is good. This is a problem when dealing with a crisis like climate change because it is the essence of a collective crisis. It is not something we can do as individuals. We tried that, right? We all changed our light bulbs and recycled. Didn't work, did it? Because actually this takes laws. This takes telling corporations that they actually can't do whatever they want. And it requires taxing them. It requires saying no to them, and these all were dismissed as so-called command and control approaches in the era that we've been dealing with climate change. So we could only talk about market-friendly measures, carbon trading, and so on, and those are in countries that did anything at all, like in Europe. Now, the argument I make in This Changes Everything is that this is not all bad news. There's a couple of ways that you could see this. Some of my friends in the environmental movement have sort of said to me, you know, Naomi, climate change was big enough, did you have to make it about capitalism, right? And I can see where they're coming from, but the argument that I make is that it is not as if we are dealing with an economic system that is going really, really well, except for the small matter of rising sea levels. It is actually an economic system that is failing the vast majority of people on this planet. Ask people in Detroit having their water cut off, or people in Greece who keep trying to vote in governments that will take on austerity and they keep ending up with it. This system is failing a great many people, but what climate change does is it puts us on a firm and unyielding science-based deadline, and it says it's not enough to oppose these policies. We actually need to change the system, and we have to do it fast. The right understands this. You know, if you look at the statistics on who denies climate change, you know, most people in the United States don't deny climate change. But if you look at the far right of the political spectrum, and you ask people about their worldview, those with an extremely hierarchical worldview overwhelmingly deny climate change. People who don't believe in a positive role for government at all, who believe that poor people generally get what they deserve, overwhelmingly deny climate change. And you know, there have been all kinds of research done on this at Yale University looking at the correlation between worldview and belief in climate change. And the reason for that is that if you have this worldview that sees no role for the collective, that sees any intervention in the market as a crime against humanity, then you are going to have a big problem with climate change, because the right understands that you can't deal with this crisis without market intervention. And you know, I spent a fair bit of time hanging out at the Heartland Institute, this sort of hotbed of climate change denial, and they're very open about it, that they don't come to this from the scientific perspective. This is a free market think tank. And they only got interested in climate change when they realized that if the science was true, then it would mean that their whole ideological project falls apart. So they chose to, as Joseph Bass told me, the head of the Heartland Institute, we decided to take a second look at the science, right? So, you know, I said I think this can be good news because this system is failing us on so many other fronts. We know we have to get corporations out of politics for basically any reason you can name, whether it's healthcare, gun control, or climate change. This puts us on a deadline. And we have a chance to build a more humane, fair, more equitable system as we transition off fossil fuels. Now, I have been called an optimist, which I struggle with, I have to tell you. Because I don't come to this issue out of sort of just thinking about the sunny side of disasters. Those of you who know my last book, The Shock Doctrine, know that, I come to this really by looking very closely at the worst that humans are capable of in the midst of crisis. The shock doctrine begins and ends with Hurricane Katrina, and this process that led me to write this book very much began 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago, when, like all of you, I assume, I turned on my television and saw people on their rooftops in New Orleans holding signs that said help, and watched helicopters pass them by. People abandoned in hospitals, like Memorial and Charity in New Orleans. I guess unlike most people, because I'm weird, I went to New Orleans while it was still flooded. I was working on the shock doctrine, and researched that firsthand, researched what was going on in New Orleans. And that's where I saw so vividly this collision between this ideological project that has been ascendant in the decades that we've been dealing with climate change, and what we have to do in the face of the crisis. Because if we think about Katrina, what happened there, the disaster was not just the result of a hurricane. Katrina was a huge storm, but by the time it hit New Orleans, it had been downgraded to a tropical storm. It was no longer a Category 5 hurricane. It should never have broken the levees. It broke the levees because the levees had been neglected, like so much of our public infrastructure, like so much of the public sphere. And then the next stage of disaster happened because all levels of government were entirely dysfunctional. People here in Michigan don't know anything about that, I'm sure. But, if you remember the shock that FEMA, the department in charge of disaster response, couldn't seem to find New Orleans for 5 days, and people were abandoned in the Superdome, in the convention center, without food, without water. But worse than that, because it wasn't just the collision of heavy weather and weak and neglected, willfully neglected public infrastructure and government that couldn't organize an evacuation. Layered on top of that was the legacy and current reality of racism and white supremacy. So then those victims were further victimized in the media, on Fox, called animals. There were all of these unfounded rumors about how babies were being raped in the Superdome. All of them turned out to be lies. Then there were all the signs, members, looters will be shot on sight. Looters, just people looking for food, for diapers for their kids. And then people were called refugees in their own country. They were rescued at gunpoint in public housing, given one-way tickets out of their city. And it became this social engineering project. First came the shock, then came what I call the shock doctrine. Because when New Orleans was emptied of all of those inconvenient people, with all of their inconvenient ideas about how their schools should be rebuilt, how their public housing should be rebuilt, it was treated as a blank slate. Now, there was one quote, and this was said while I was in New Orleans. The city was still underwater. And Richard Baker, who's then a Republican congressman from Louisiana, he said, "We finally cleaned up public housing in New Orleans. We couldn't do it, but God did it." Remember that? And that's what happened. Many housing projects in New Orleans that were not even flooded were demolished, replaced with condominiums and townhouses, and the school system in New Orleans came under the same sort of attack. Thousands of teachers were fired, the school board was taken over under cover of emergency, and New Orleans now has the most privatized school system in the United States. Before the storm, there were 8 charter schools in New Orleans. Now nearly 95% of the city's public school students attend a charter school. Charity Hospital, which was it's a public hospital, a teaching hospital. It was one of the only places where poor African Americans could get health care in the city. It is still locked. It's still padlocked. It should have been reopened. It wasn't reopened. It was one more example of taking advantage of a crisis that was born out of a collision between heavy weather and a weak and neglected public sphere to just finish off the public sphere altogether, whether it's the schools, public housing, or public hospitals. So this